Hi, I'm Pastor Seth Williamson, lead pastor at Church of the Ascension here in McKinney, Texas. Welcome to our podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be looking at some stuff from this book called Church Refugees, and we're going to kind of rethink how Christians in the church should view and approach those who have left the church, those who are de-churched. So a lot of times in sort of missiology, which is the study of how to do missions, how to go out and spread the gospel, we talk about certain kind of categories of people. And since it's kind of hard for us to judge a person's heart, I don't actually see your heart. Even if you're in church, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to heaven. What I can see is your relationship to the church. Jesus died for the church. He started the church. The church is his bride. It is the physical manifestation of the kingdom of God here on earth. It is the gathering of believers where the word is preached and the sacraments are administered. So the church is important to Jesus. So we talk about people who are de-churched, unchurched, or lightly churched. So an unchurched person is someone who has no church background. They didn't grow up in church. It's just not part of life. And maybe they grew up Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or whatever it may be. They didn't grow up in church. Lightly church means maybe you're like a Christmas and Easter kind of Christian, or maybe you went to VBS growing up, but you were never really involved in church. You're not unfamiliar with church. You just have a very sort of cursory relationship to the church. And then finally, there's the de-churched. The de-churched are folks who were in church at one time but left for one reason or the other. And a lot of ink has been spilled in my lifetime talking about that last group, the de-churched, people who are leaving church. And there's a lot of sort of clickbait headlines out there about the American church is in trouble, our numbers are declining, people are leaving church, people are done with church. A lot of folks talking about the nuns and the duns, right? The nuns, those who have no religion at all, which is a sort of a new thing for American Christianity, because a lot of the revivalistic spirit of American Christianity relies upon folks having some kind of knowledge of Jesus that we just go and breathe new life into. We revive them, or we get them to commit to a faith that they've been a part of in a nominal way, but never actually made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ. And as an evangelical, I really do believe that you need to do that. You need to have a personal commitment to Jesus that goes beyond just showing up at church or being involved in church activities or that sort of thing. So those are the nuns, and people are really confused. What do we do with these folks who have no religion at all? How do we approach someone who has no connection to the church, no knowledge of the church? So that's one category. The other one that's become a growing point of focus in American Christianity are the duns, the de-church, those who are done with church. And, on the one hand, there are folks, usually for political reasons, who are excited about this. They go, okay, good. We have freed these people's minds from the stranglehold that evangelicalism had on them, and perhaps now we can talk some sense into them and get them to finally come over to our side politically. And then there are those like myself who are really vexed by this, and it disturbs us to see people leave the church. Now, for most of my life, this group of people, we've thought of them as sort of the nominal Christians. We thought of them as the lightly churched. And we blamed the shrinking numbers of church attendance on the lightly churched, on those who kind of came on Sunday because it's something to do, didn't really have a faith with Jesus. They had a very shallow faith. They're not really committed to the idea of church. And when things get hard, like a pandemic comes and they get out of the habit of going to church, they move away, whatever it may be, they stop going because they were never very committed to begin with. And so a lot of times the narrative about the de-churched was God is pruning his church. Like he is pruning away dead branches. He's getting rid of the lukewarm. He's spitting the lukewarm out of his mouth. And certainly that is happening. As church becomes less of a cultural linchpin where people come together for reasons other than just faith. Church is a place to network. Church is a place to gather. Church is a place to receive uplifting moral teaching, which, by the way, these are all common graces the church gives to the world. And when I say common grace, I mean those are graces that God gives to everyone despite their status with Jesus. We are salt and light. We give away food and clothing and housing. We do youth projects. We do all kinds of stuff, people that are not our members, right? The church is one of the only organizations that exists for the benefit of both its members and its non-members alike, right? So we do it for everyone, not just for those who show up on Sunday and tithe and volunteer and are committed to the church. So a lot of the talk about this was maybe it's actually a good thing to sort of get these people out, because then those who are left are going to be more serious about the faith. We can challenge them more. We can get more work done because these people are the ones who are really actually committed to the faith. And that was a narrative that a lot of us talked out for a long time, and it's still sort of the narrative that goes around, that those who are leaving the church are just not very interested in it. That was until I got a hold of this book called Church Refugees. It was written by a man named Josh Packard, who's a PhD from the University of North Colorado. He's a sociologist. And then Ashley Hope, who's a doctorate of sociology at Vanderbilt, also contributed to this book. And they take a sociological approach to why people are done with the church, but not their faith. And that's the subtitle. Church Refugees, Sociologists Reveal That People Are Done with the Church, but not their faith. And as I read, I've not finished the book yet, but as I read just the beginning chapters, I found some pretty interesting new facts and data. And whenever I approach books like these, I'm usually expecting to hear the same old, okay? Like, for example, I went onto a webinar recently, and this webinar was all about, the laws of evangelism, or how to overcome the hurdles of evangelism. And it was a lot of stuff I've heard before, but what was interesting was I attended this webinar after reading the first half of this book. And during the webinar, it's on Zoom, they're soliciting from the audience answers to questions. Like, why do you think that non-Christians don't want to be around Christians? And they say things like, well, Christians are weird, and they're not very friendly, and maybe they're afraid of unbelievers, or maybe they're just kind of stuck up, or maybe they just are inflexible in their beliefs and that kind of thing. And then they go, what? Okay, so that's why Christians, non-Christians don't like Christians. Why do you think that Christians don't want to be around non-Christians? They go, well, maybe we don't want to sell our reputations, or maybe we're afraid they'll pervert our kids or something, or whatever it may be. And as I'm listening to this audience, I'm just thinking to myself, I know that this is not true. They're not asking unchurched people why they're not going to church. I know this because I've read other books, like the book You Found Me, where they've actually done surveys and have gotten data that actually show the opposite, that most unchurched people are not hostile to Christianity. They're actually just apathetic about the faith because it's just not their faith. They do not feel guilty about not going to church because they're not Christians. Just like I don't feel guilty about not going to mosque or to the synagogue or the Hindu temple because I'm not part of those faiths. And there's actually a great openness towards Christianity from those who are nuns, who are unchurched people. And this is just a matter of showing you actually care about people, creating deep relationships, showing the church is actually relevant to society, that sort of thing. These are the kind of things that actually work on that unchurched group and getting them to see that they might actually need a relationship with Jesus Christ. The flip side is interesting, though, because as I was now listening to this crowd of Christians talk about why they think that Christians are not actually going out there and living their faith, I realized that this is actually their complaints. These are people who are deeply committed to the church, who are actually voicing their own frustrations about Christianity. Maybe they think that Christians are stuck up. Maybe they think Christians are boring, or Christians are weird, or that Christians are irrelevant. These are people who are probably on their way out the door, and they are trying desperately to save the church from within by doing all the things that Jesus called us to do. Now, why do I have that new perspective? Well, because what these two folks find out in this book, what they tell us in this book, is that the D Church are not nominal Christians. They're usually the most committed people to the faith. And they're not people who believe the church itself is bad. right? And in fact, there's a very small segment of the population in America that views church as a negative thing. Most folks, whether they're Christian or not, view church and going to church as a positive thing on society, or at least a neutral thing on society. So these are not people who think, we got to reinvent Christianity. These are folks that actually fight for the church and want to and love the church and want to see the church succeed. And so they devote their lives to the church. They usually have ministry positions. They volunteer. They give of their time and money. They know their Bibles. These people, of all the things you can say about them, you cannot say that they're not committed to the church. They are. And so that's kind of a disturbing fact at that point, right? Because now we go, oh no, this is not just like, okay, we're just getting rid of dead weight. The funny thing is, the very folks that most of us thought were the ones leaving, the nominal Christians, are the ones who are staying. And so we have a big problem on our hands that we're actually scaring off the committed workforce, the heart of the church, and the only folks who are left are those who are the ones not very committed. It's the lightly churched who are staying, whereas the heavily committed Christians are the ones who are leaving. Some of the other interesting things that I was reading in this book were things like, most of the time, they don't leave easily. They're not scared off easily. It takes about 4 different occasions of church hurt for them to finally say they can't do church anymore. They're just over it. They'll be at one church, they'll be very involved. They try to speak up. They try to help reform the church. They try to help fix things. They get shut down. They get hurt. And they go into another church. And they do the same thing there, where they're working really hard. They're really involved. They believe in the church. They believe in Jesus. They believe in the Bible. They're working really hard. And then they get hurt again. And then they go to a third church and do that. And then they finally get to a fourth church. On average, by the time they get to their fourth church, when the church hurt happens there, that's when they're done with church. They still love Jesus. They still love God, but they cannot be in an institutional church anymore. And so a lot of them find themselves going to Bible studies or home churches or things like that are less institutional and just a little safer for people who have been hurt by the institution of the church. And usually the number one complaint they have is that these churches are only existing for the sake of their members. They only exist to serve themselves. They're creating programs for Christians, activities for Christians, and they wear these people out running these programs, but they don't actually see any real change in the world around them, and they never really feel like they can bring their unbelieving friends to church because that church they're at is not really for their unbelieving friends. It's not been engineered or designed to be a conversion community where unbelievers, lightly church folks can come in and actually experience Jesus and have a encounter with him and then make a commitment to him. These are just sort of institutions that exist for the sake of the institution. Now, that kind of gets into another thing is like, I'm still reading this book, but I can see some of the places they're going is they might be suggesting that we sort of radically change the way we do church. I kind of agree with Tim Keller in his book Center Church, where he talks about, is the church a movement or an institution? And like everything else in Center Church, he says, actually, the church is in the center. It is both. It is both a movement and an institution. When you have a movement that is international, has billions of adherents, it cannot just be a decentralized group of people all studying the Bible by themselves. And as I talked about on our last episode, it's actually not a really healthy thing for people to be involved in. To have an incredibly decentralized, very individualistic faith does not lead to happiness and joy. It actually leads to a lot of depression and confusion. And so having an institution like the Roman Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or even the Lutheran Church or Presbyterian Church that is more structured, that is more about being part of a communal whole, is actually better for our faith than not. So we can't just get rid of the institution. We have to have institutions. We have to have bank accounts and buildings and clergy and employees and all the other things it takes. But at the same time, we cannot lose the movement, the heart of Christianity, that is this sort of radical way of living your life as sort of freely and organically moving through the world, right? And so what you can think about is all ministries have a life cycle, right? You start something, in the spring, it goes up through the summer, and then you get to here at the top where you're like, all those seeds you planted, you're now harvesting. And you can stay up here for a very, very long time, harvesting the fruits of whatever ministry you've begun, whether it's a camp, a youth ministry, a small group. But eventually, you go through the fall, and then you get to the winter of that ministry where that is no longer producing any fruit. So the question is this: why did we start this to begin with? Well, we started small groups because we want people to connect and study the Bible, and so we want connection, and we want to be doing Bible study and community. Well, okay, our life groups and homes are actually no one's going to them anymore. It's just the same people over and over again. No one's actually joining them anymore. So perhaps we've actually sunsetted this ministry, and instead of just saying we're not doing connection and Bible study, we now have to rethink, how do we actually do this? So we go back over here and plant new seeds, start something new, and then we can begin to reap the harvest from that once again. So an institution like the church that's been around for 2,000 years has only survived because it's found a way to sort of redo things over and over again. When I was growing up in the Baptist church, I was kind of coming out of the tail end of the Sunday school movement, which kind of began in urban centers as a place for kids to go on Sunday morning when there wasn't work or school. And it was a classroom setting where there was homework and assignments, and it was a Sunday school. And you can even see that in the architecture of Baptist churches. They always have an education building, which is a building full of classrooms for children and adults to go and do Sunday school. Well, around the time I was a teenager, that was kind of going through its sunset period. And then the question was, well, how do we continue to have this where we're educating people on the Bible and getting them into fellowship with one another? Maybe we'll do life groups. And so instead of being in a classroom, we'll be in a home. Instead of having homework, we'll just do studies together that are very relevant and very easy to understand, or read books together. It'll be more discussion-based and more synergistic. We'll do like potlucks together, and we'll have the kids play together, and we'll go bowling together, and maybe start Little League together, whatever it may be. They went back and said, okay, the Sunday school thing's no longer working. We want to accomplish the same goal, but now we want to do something else. And there's a lot of frustration in that because now you have this massive education building sitting empty because now everyone's meeting in their homes. And so a lot of folks were like, well, why we even build this stinking thing? It costs us $1 million to build if no one's even going to use it. And so there's a lot of like friction between there. So change creates friction creates heat, and then there's some division over that sort of thing. But we have to be able to continue to say, okay, we want to accomplish the Great Commission. If the way we've been doing it's not working, perhaps we need to rethink it. So what I'm saying is the church is an institution and a movement. We can't all just be in home churches, right? Eventually, a home church gets like our church is now too big for my home. So we have to go to another church in town, and we're going to rent some space from them. We're going to have childcare, and we're going to meet in a classroom. And so a classroom bigger than my living room, right? Where we can have like AV and we can get a little more systems in place because it's now the time for that. So if a church is going to continue to grow, it cannot just be decentralized. A thing as big as Christianity has to be both an institution and a movement at the exact same time. And that's a fine line to walk. It's a difficult thing to do. So my heart is, as a church planner, we want churches, we want these institutions, but they have to be centered around people and relationships and the Great Commission and the Word of God and all those kinds of things, keeping the gospel at the forefront and not just having, having these things to have them. I heard a story just yesterday about from a couple who were involved in several other church plants who heard about a guy who was given $800,000 from a church to go start a new church. And so what does he do? He hires staff, he rents a space, he gets a big printer, he gets all this AV equipment, spends like $100,000 on AV equipment, and my head's spinning because I'm like, I'm going to spend like $10,000 on sound equipment, and I think even that's astronomical. But he blew through the money, and the church just folded because he was just like, what do churches have? They have printers, and they have secretaries, and music directors, and they have big light shows, and he just burned that big pile of money because this is what churches have. But churches have to have those relationships and people and mission and passion, and they need to be a movement. And then you begin to use that money and an infrastructure to support the church as it grows beyond something that an individual pastor can just manage in his own time. So we have to be an institution, but at the same time, we have to remember that, okay, we're having a big problem here is that our most committed members are getting burnt out and leaving from church hurt, and we're actually probably doing some damage in the process. And so as we begin to approach the de-churched, and this has been my experience here in North Texas, is that almost all the folks who have left church can tell me some kind of story about how they were a youth pastor, or they were involved in outreach, or they were a worship leader, or maybe they were even a pastor, and they just couldn't do it anymore. They tried and they tried and they tried. They wanted to stay, but they just could not make it work anymore. And so as a result, heartbroken, they had to leave that for the health of their family and for the sake of their own faith. They go, listen, if I stay here, my kids are going to deconvert. They're going to leave the church. And so I got to go somewhere else, or else my kids are going to become apostates. And then they go, I'm depressed, I'm burnt out, I'm tired, and I don't actually know why we're doing this anymore. And so they just have to leave and go somewhere else. So we need to approach the de-church with a lot of compassion and not view them as just these sort of reprobate, anti-Christian people. They're actually people that need a lot of healing and compassion as well. As I was reading this, I also thought back to something I thought about when I watched the movie Spotlight, which is a really good movie about the Boston Globe, how they uncovered the sex abuse scandal that was going on in the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church, if you don't know, had a problem with a lot of priests who were molesting children. And instead of defrocking these priests, charging them with a crime, throwing them in jail like they deserve to be, the Catholic Church conspired to simply move these priests around to save itself the embarrassment, or whatever the reason may be. Perhaps they wanted to show compassion to these priests and continue to have them in ministry. Perhaps they wanted to save face. Whatever it was, they would just move these priests. They would go send them away for a while where they couldn't hurt anybody, and then have them try again somewhere else. And then inevitably, because this is what child abusers do, they continue to abuse children. And throughout the movie, they interviewed, again, this is a dramatization of the actual events. They interviewed people who had been abused by these priests, and there was a common thread of all these kids. First off, they met the typical profile of a kid that gets abused. They come from a rough family that's not very tight. Maybe dad's not in the picture. Maybe they're poor. They just have a rough home life. And abusers tend to look for kids that are isolated and unstable because they're easy to manipulate and they're easy to take advantage of. And they usually won't tell anybody either, because who are they going to tell? But if they have a dad in their life who's a strong influence and the family's very close and they're kind of watching out for each other and the kids feel a sense of belonging and happiness and stability, they're less likely to be targeted by child predators. I'm not saying it's 100% of the time. I'm just saying this is what we know about the kind of kids that end up being victimized. And so, side note, you need to protect those kids in your church that have those unstable home lives, because they are vulnerable. God designed the family to protect women and children, and to give men something to do with all their energy that's productive and good. And so when that begins to break down, we begin to see that kids and women become more vulnerable to attack from evil men and evil women. And so when you have kids like that in your church, you got to pay special attention to them. And of course, now we have all these great protocols in place at churches in response to this sex abuse scandal. But I digress. So these kids, first off, they were usually the typical targets of abuse. But secondly, they almost always were heavily involved in their church. They were acolytes, altar boys. They were in the choir. The church was a home to them. It was a place for them that made them feel important and gave them an identity they were not getting from their home life. And so my big takeaway after hearing a lot of these stories, and a lot of these kids were kids that had same-sex attraction. They would call themselves gay. And so that was another layer that these priests would kind of identify that and then take advantage of it. But they were heavily involved in church. And so whenever a priest began to pay attention to them, it was like God paying attention to them. And you might have an issue with that. Go, well, hey, the priest isn't God. But here's the thing. The Bible says, how can you love God whom you can't see if you hate Christians who you can see, right? God is just a figment of your imagination. He's easy to love, but Christians who you can see are hard to love. And so the actual test of your love for God is your love for the church. And so there is a sense in which a pastor is the physical presence of God. And that's why hospital ministry is so important when someone's dying of cancer and a priest shows up in his clergy collar with a prayer book to read the Bible and pray for them. It feels like God visited them in the hotel room that day or in the hospital room that day. God was there in that moment. And when priests are absent from that, people feel abandoned by God. And so, yeah, there's a sense in which the priest, it's like God talking to you. And that's why it's not everyone should be a priest. You need to be qualified to do that. So these kids are like, well, God is paying attention to me. I have a spiritual connection with this guy. And then what happens? He abuses them. And so on one sense, there's the trauma of being molested. And then on the other hand, there's the trauma of the fact that these kids really loved being Catholic. They did not want to leave the Catholic Church. They liked being an altar boy. They liked singing in the choir. They liked going to Mass. It was a big part of their life. And they cannot go back to that part of their life now because of the trauma and the pain they've experienced and the shame they've experienced and the betrayal they've experienced by being molested by a priest. So you see how that kind of works there. So many of these people who are angry because they're angry at something or someone they love. They love the church. They love being part of the church. They loved their priest, but the church betrayed them, and that's where a lot of that anger is coming from. And so many people who have left church, when you invite them back to church, they imagine that. They imagine all the pain and trauma they went through at the church that they were at. And when you say, I'd like to invite you to church, they are now imagining going back to all that. And so what we have to do is create what are called corrective emotional experiences. For example, if you grew up in a household where you had an abusive father, it might be very hard for you to get along with men. But if you then go and experience some healthy male relationships that are fatherly from an older male, and he's kind and gentle but strong and is a good man, that actually heals the pain that you experience from having a bad man in your life. It becomes a corrective emotional experience. I've had experiences with friends of mine who were female who had been raped, and I began to have a friendship with them, and I proved to be a safe person who was not trying to have sex with them, and that actually healed them from their rape experience. Even though I'm not a counselor or a therapist or anything like that, I was just being a good friend. And that kind of helped them be like, okay, maybe I can trust men again. Maybe I can actually have male friendships that are not sexual and are not dangerous. So we have to figure out ways as churches to create a welcoming environment that is actually committed not just to the survival of the institution, but to the health and well-being and spiritual mental health of the people that we encounter. So that means a couple of things. So this is not a super long episode today, but a couple of things that Christians can do for churches that they can do. First and foremost, you got to get out and actually get involved in the life of your community. Jesus called us to be fishers of men, right? Well, if you go to an aquarium and you cast a line in the aquarium, you can't say you're actually fishing because those fish are already caught, right? That's cheating, right? So moving fish between fish tanks is not being a fisher of men. You actually have to go out into the ocean and cast a net and catch people who are not already in the fish tank. So that means getting involved in the life of your community. Here in McKinney, Texas is a very German state. If you didn't know that, it was settled by Germans. And so Oktoberfest is a pretty big deal in Texas. And McKinney has a really big Oktoberfest. So we have an option as a church, right? We can do our own fall festival that probably no one's going to come to because they're not looking for that. Or we can just go to Oktoberfest and get involved there, have a booth there that serves a purpose, meet people, fellowship with people, be involved in the fall festival of our city, as opposed to just creating our own fall festival over here for our members. And so going out and actually fishing and being involved in the world and the life of your city will send a signal to the D Church that you actually care about more than just the survival of your institution. The other thing we have to do is we have to give people a chance to just be. Give them a space to simply be present without immediately going to them and challenging them on something. I'm not saying that people should just stay in that space forever, but people need a chance to feel this out. Are these people safe? Do they actually care about me? What happens when conflict comes up? Because conflict's going to come up, but how do they handle conflict? Does my pastor actually care about my voice? Is there an accountability structure here? Another great thing about being Anglican is that I have a pastor over me, my bishop. So all the priests in the ACNA have an accountability person, an experienced, wise pastor who actually has authority over them. And so if I mess up, my bishop can step in and deal with it instead of just leaving it to the lay people to have to deal with this a crazy pastor or something like that. So we have to. So first off, so number one, we have to actually be out in the world, doing things that matter to people, and being interested in those who are not already part of our church, and doing things that are relevant to our community in the name of Jesus. Blessing, be a blessing to those around you. And then secondly, you have to create that space where people can just kind of explore your church for a while and know that it is a safe place to be. Not a perfect place, not a place free of conflict, but at least a place that is healthy and functioning well. And the third thing is this. We have to find a way to care for those who are struggling with church and their faith. So many of the people that were interviewed for this story, for this book, when they would share their story, they would say things like they began to struggle, but there was no place for them to voice their concerns because that concern was registered as an attack, as a criticism. It was dangerous. And so many people are beginning to ask questions like, well, why do we do it like this? How come we have this or why that? And when they don't actually get answers to that question, it causes them to go, okay, so I guess I'm never going to get an answer. I'm a dangerous person. I'm a threat to the church because of my doubts and my confusions. And so I should probably just leave, right? When someone has a child that is on drugs, or maybe they're transgender, or they're cutting themselves, or they get pregnant out of wedlock, we have to come alongside them with grace and the gospel and practice the gospel in their lives, and not simply just kind of interrogate them or question them or point fingers at them, but actually be a sounding board and a place for them to heal. That's kind of what Lent does in the Anglican Church. Lent is a season of fasting and mourning and repentance for those who are struggling with these things to get closer to God in a season of quiet. It's a season of reconciliation, a season of seeking God. And it births out Easter, which is that, okay, I have all this sin in my life, all these doubts, all this pain, and I'm carrying it through Lent on my back. And then what does Lent lead up to? It leads up to the cross and the resurrection. Jesus dies for all those problems, all the pain and brokenness in our world, and he rises again to newness of life. He's the firstborn of the new creation, and there's our great hope, a world that is freed from death. Jesus has these fatal wounds on his body, these scars, and yet he does not die. That's the kind of world we want to live in, where the fatal wounds that we bear do not kill us, but we continue to live in the power of Christ. So we have to create a place of rest, a place where those concerns can actually be voiced, not viewed as a threat, but actually as someone dealing with God. I'll share this last story, and then I'll kind of close things out. There's a Bible study I'm a part of out in the community. And one of the days I was not there, a man came who is not usually go, and he's got a lot of pain in his life, a lot of trauma in his past. And in the middle of the Bible study, he throws his Bible on the floor and begins to curse God and curse Jesus. And everyone is horrified. What are we supposed to do? That's not how you're supposed to act. And by the way, it's not how you're supposed to act. Having an outburst in any kind of setting is not appropriate. But a lot of the Christians in that group felt a great deal of shame because they're like, man, we must have done something wrong to make this guy flip out. We must have screwed something up. But when I look at that, what I see is someone doing business with God. Anger is better than apathy. Anger is an emotion we get when we're trying to work through something, when we need to deal with something in our lives. And so if you're cursing God, at least you're talking to God, at least you're thinking about God, at least you're engaged with God, and that might be the first step to actually having a relationship with God and actually drawing near to God, as opposed to viewing it as a threat or a bad thing. Obviously, if someone's being disruptive, you have to figure out a way to handle that disruption so that the group is not sort of like horrified by it, right? But you also want to take that person aside and be like, what's going on here? How can we help you and minister to you, as opposed to viewing it as a threat, right? There are threats to unity. Gossip, backbiting, rumors, unforgiveness, all those sorts of things are a threat to the unity of the church. Those are the things that should not be tolerated. But when someone is angry and confused and full of doubt, that's not a threat, that's an opportunity. And so we need to rethink how we approach the de-church in our lives. Instead of thinking of them as just these sort of reprobate spiritual losers who just didn't have enough gumption to stick it out, we should view them as people who still want to walk with Jesus, but have a hard time returning to the kind of church experience they had before. And I believe whether you're a church plant or a Bible study or an established church, you can foster those kinds of environments by turning your focus away from just maintaining the status quo to actually being centered on the lives and concerns of individual people in your congregation. Instead of listening to CNN or Fox News and then preaching on what the anchorman said, listen to those in the coffee shop, in the restaurants, in the cigar lounges, in the bars, in your neighborhood. Do you even know your neighbors? Have you invited them over for dinner? When you hear what they say, preach on that. That's the kind of stuff you need to be preaching on. Not what is the current hot topic of the day, but what is the current concern of the actual sheep in your pasture. So we need to continue to pray for those who have walked away from the faith, or at least walked away from the church, who still want to walk with Jesus. And we need to walk with them until they return to the bride of Christ, until they're ready to say, I'm ready to be back in fellowship with Christians in a way that's good for me and good for my family. So I hope this was helpful. Make sure to comment and subscribe and like this video. Share with those around you if you find it helpful. And tune in next time for the next episode of the Ascension McKinney podcast.